They say a mother's love is unconditional, but they never tell you about the fine print. They never mention the clauses about diminishing returns, or the depreciation of your worth over time. For 40 years, I gave my love freely, like it was a natural resource that could never be depleted. I thought it was priceless. It took a 79-cent fridge magnet to teach me that my love did, in fact, have a price. A very specific one. And it was a bargain. This isn't a story about a magnet. It's a story about the bill that came due when I finally realized I had been sold for parts. It's about how I took a lifetime of so-called unconditional love and submitted a final, non-negotiable invoice. So if you've ever felt taken for granted, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, then settle in. I'm going to tell you how the cheapest gift I ever received became the most expensive lesson my son ever learned. And while you're here, if you find a piece of your own story in mine, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel and ring that bell for notifications. Your support means more than you know. Now, let me take you back to that Mother's Day, the day the scales didn't just fall from my eyes. They were ripped off with such force it's a wonder I didn't bleed. It all began, as most of my modern heartaches did, with my daughter-in-law, Samantha. She had chosen the restaurant, a place that was less about food and more about being seen. The walls were stark white, the chairs were punishingly artistic, and the menu was written in a font so small it felt like an eye exam designed to weed out anyone over the age of 50. I sat there, feeling like a dusty antique someone had accidentally placed in a minimalist art gallery. The brunch was a performance, and I was a reluctant member of the audience. Across the table, my son, Mark, sat next to his wife, Samantha, and her mother, Carol. Carol was a perfectly pleasant woman, always immaculately dressed, her life a testament to salon appointments and leisurely lunches. She and I had nothing in common except for the fact that our children had married each other. Samantha chatted on about their upcoming trip to Tuscany, the new features on their imported SUV, and the shocking cost of organic, fair trade, artisanal dog biscuits for their hypoallergenic poodle. Mark just nodded along, his eyes glazed over with the placid contentment of a man who has outsourced his entire personality to his wife. I mostly listened, sipping my water, adding a quiet comment here and there that was usually swallowed by a fresh wave of Samantha's monologue. I was the designated conversational placeholder, the quiet, grey backdrop against which their vibrant life was painted. I was used to it. After my husband, Frank, passed away 10 years ago, my role in my son's life had gradually shifted. I went from being his mother, his confidant, his partner in navigating life's early challenges, to being an obligation. A box to be ticked on holidays. Visit mom, check. Call mom, check. Invite mom to a brunch where she'll feel entirely out of place, check. It was a slow erosion, so quiet I had barely noticed the ground giving way beneath my feet until I was standing on a cliff's edge. The performance reached its crescendo with the presentation of gifts. Samantha clapped her hands together with practiced glee. "Okay, mamas, time for presents," she announced to the room at large. First, she turned to her own mother. Mark reached under the table and produced a heavy-looking box wrapped in shimmering gold paper, with a bow so elaborate it could have been a church hat. Carol's face lit up with genuine, uncomplicated delight. She unwrapped it carefully, her manicured fingers peeling back the paper to reveal a dark blue velvet box. She opened the clasp, and an audible gasp went around our little section of the restaurant. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a diamond bracelet. It wasn't subtle. It was a statement. A thick, glittering river of light that snaked around her wrist as Mark fastened it for her. "Oh, Mark." "Samantha." It's breathtaking," Carol cooed, angling her arm so the ridiculously expensive brunch spot's lighting could catch every single facet. "You shouldn't have," but her eyes said, "I'm so glad you did." Samantha beamed, leaning over to kiss her mother's cheek. "We wanted to get you something really special, Mom." You do so much for us, watching the kids, all your support. Mark nodded enthusiastically. Happy Mother's Day, Carol. You deserve it. I watched him, my son. The boy whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose fevers I had nursed, whose heartbreaks I had mended. I saw the pride in his eyes as he looked at his mother-in-law, saw the way he stood a little taller, as she flashed the bracelet at a curious couple at the next table. He was buying his way into a life he felt he deserved, and Carol was the gatekeeper. Then, it was my turn. The air, which had been crackling with the energy of a major purchase, went still. Mark's smile became a little tighter, a little more forced. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, flat envelope. The kind you get a gift card in. He slid it across the table. It landed with a soft, insignificant little flap. The contrast between the heavy, important box and this flimsy paper wafer was so stark it was almost comical. Happy Mother's Day, Mom, he said, his voice a little quieter now. His eyes didn't quite meet mine. I picked up the envelope. It was so light I thought it might be empty. I tore the seal and tipped it over. A small, plastic-wrapped refrigerator magnet slid out onto the polished white table. It was a cartoon cat, crudely drawn, with giant googly eyes. It was holding a little sign that said, "World's Best Mom." There was a profound, echoing silence. Even Samantha had the good sense to look momentarily uncomfortable. Carol stared at the magnet, as if it were a strange insect that had landed on the tablecloth. "Oh," I said. It was the only sound I could make. My throat had closed up. "It's cute." Mark finally looked at me, a flicker of something. Was it shame? Guilt, in his eyes before it was quickly extinguished by a practiced wave of dismissive cheer. "I saw it at the checkout last week and it just made me think of you," he said, as if this were a compliment. "Just a little something to make you smile, a little something." A checkout impulse buy. To make me smile. I looked from the glittering, heavy, statement-making diamonds on Carol's wrist to the cheap piece of plastic on the table in front of me. The message was as clear as the stones in her bracelet. Carol's value was measured in carats. Mine was measured in checkout counter whimsy. Her support was an investment that yielded returns. My lifetime of sacrifice was a given, a sunk cost that required no further acknowledgement. I picked up the magnet. The googly eyes rattled. I forced a smile, a brittle thing that felt like it would shatter my face. "Thank you, Mark. It's lovely." I slipped it into my purse, where it landed with a tiny, pathetic click. And in that moment, something inside me, something I thought was eternal and unbreakable, cracked right down the middle. The drive home was a study in silence. The cheerful pop music on the radio felt like a personal insult, so I turned it off. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the pavement and the frantic, chaotic monologue inside my own head. The fridge magnet was on the passenger seat beside me, its ridiculous googly eyes staring up at the roof of my sensible, 10-year-old sedan. A car paid for in cash with money Frank and I had saved. A car my son often referred to as Mom's old tank. He and Samantha leased a new luxury vehicle every 2 years, an expense I knew for a fact they couldn't afford without my regular gifts, the little cash infusions I'd provide whenever Mark called with a story about a looming bill or an unexpected expense. They called it help. I was beginning to understand it was just fuel. Fuel for a lifestyle I had funded but was never truly welcome in. I pulled into the driveway of my small brick house, the house Frank and I had bought 45 years ago. The house where we'd brought Mark home from the hospital. The house where every wall, every floorboard, was saturated with my own history of sacrifice. I remembered when Frank got sick. It was a long, slow decline. The last 2 years of his life were a blur of hospital visits, medication schedules, and sleepless nights. I was working full-time as a bookkeeper then, a steady, quiet job. But it wasn't enough. So, I took a second job. 3 nights a week, after my 8-hour day, I went and worked as a nurse's aide on the overnight shift at the local nursing home. I would come home at 7 in the morning, my body aching, the smell of antiseptic clinging to my clothes, just in time to get Mark up and ready for his last year of high school. I'd sleep for a few hours before I had to go to my day job. I did that for 18 months. I ran on coffee and sheer will. Mark knew, of course. He saw how tired I was. He'd sometimes make me a cup of tea when I got home, his face etched with a teenager's fleeting concern. But he never truly understood. How could he? His life remained untouched. His lunches were packed, his sports uniforms were clean, and his future was secure. My exhaustion was just the background noise of his adolescence. Then came college. He was a bright boy, and he had his heart set on a private university 3 states away. It was prestigious, and Samantha, his high school sweetheart, was going there. The price tag was astronomical. We had some money saved, but not nearly enough for the first year's tuition and board. Mark was accepted, and the acceptance package came with a bill that made my hands shake. Frank and I sat at the kitchen table, the same one I sat at now, and we looked at the numbers. Frank, ever the pragmatist, suggested the state school. It was a fine institution. But Mark was devastated. He accused us of not believing in him, of trying to hold him back. He and Samantha had a plan, he said. This was their future. I couldn't bear the look of disappointment on his face. So, the next day, while Frank was at work, I went to my jewelry box. I took out a string of pearls and a diamond brooch that had belonged to my own mother. They were the only truly valuable things I owned, keepsakes from a woman I had adored. I sold them. I told Frank I'd lost them. He was upset, but he believed me. The money from that sale, combined with our savings, was enough to cover the deposit and the first semester. Mark was overjoyed. He hugged me so tightly I thought my ribs would crack. Thanks, Mom. You're the best. I'll make it up to you, I promise, he'd said. It was a promise he had long since forgotten, but I never had. I could still feel the phantom weight of those pearls on my skin. The sacrifices didn't stop after Frank passed. If anything, they escalated. Mark, armed with his expensive degree, decided he was an entrepreneur. He had a can't-miss idea for a lifestyle brand, a term I never fully understood. It seemed to involve selling expensive coffee mugs with ironic sayings on them. He and the now-graduated Samantha were convinced it would make them millionaires. All they needed was startup capital. They were rejected by every bank. Their business plan, they complained, was too forward-thinking for the loan officers. The truth was, it was a flimsy, half-baked idea with no solid numbers to back it up. But Mark was my son. And he was so passionate. He painted a picture of success, of financial freedom, of being able to take care of me one day. So I did the one thing Frank had always warned me against. I leveraged our home. I took out a second mortgage on my paid-off house, the rock-solid foundation of my security, and I gave him the money. $75,000. The lifestyle brand folded in less than 2 years. The money was gone. All of it. I never saw a dime. There was no apology, just a new set of excuses. The market wasn't right. Their suppliers let them down. It was a learning experience. For him, maybe. For me, it was a second job working weekends at the public library until I was 67 to pay off the debt he had incurred against my name. He and Samantha moved on, getting corporate jobs, buying a house I knew they couldn't afford, having children. And through it all, I was the safety net. The emergency fund. The quiet, reliable source of cash that patched the holes in their extravagant life. I never said no. Because I was his mother. And a mother's love is unconditional. That's what I had always believed. But as I sat in my quiet kitchen, the silence of the house pressing in on me, I realized I had been confusing love with liability. My love for my son had become his greatest asset, and my own self-worth, my own security, my own future, had become an acceptable loss. I got up from the table and walked over to the refrigerator. It's an old one, a Whirlpool that came with the house. It hums a little too loudly, but it's never failed me. Frank used to call it all reliable. The door was covered in a mosaic of my life. A photo of Frank and me on a fishing trip. A postcard from my sister in Florida. A drawing from my grandson, Jack, from when he was 5, a wobbly stick figure he'd labeled Gamma. I took the new magnet out of my purse. The plastic felt cheap and slick in my fingers. I unwrapped it and looked at the cartoon cat. World's best mom, the words seemed to mock me. They were a hollow echo in the vast, empty space of my son's gratitude. I pressed the magnet onto the white enamel of the door. The tiny piece of metal inside it wasn't strong enough. It slid down a few inches before catching on the edge of the freezer handle. A weak magnet. A weak sentiment. A perfect metaphor. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. I wasn't crying. The hurt had gone past tears and solidified into something cold and hard in my chest. It felt like a stone. I thought about the bracelet on Carol's wrist. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the thought. The effort. The intention. The bracelet said, "You are valuable. Your contribution to our lives is seen and appreciated, and we will demonstrate that value in a tangible way." The magnet said, "You are an afterthought. Your contribution is assumed, like the air we breathe. You exist for our convenience, and here is a token to keep you placated until we need you again." A switch flipped inside my mind. It wasn't a loud, dramatic snap. It was a quiet, definitive click, like a deadbolt sliding firmly into place. I turned and looked at the photograph of Frank and me on our wedding day. We were so young. He had his arm around me, and we were both laughing. He had this incredible belief in me. He was a mechanic by trade, a man who worked with his hands, but he had a mind like a steel trap. And he always treated me like his partner, his equal. "Helen," he'd say to me, usually when I was doubting myself, "you're the smartest person I know. You have a mind for numbers and a heart of gold. Don't ever let anyone, and I mean anyone, make you feel small." For 10 years since his death, I had been letting my own son make me feel small. I had been letting him and his wife treat me like a utility. A faucet of love and money that they could turn on whenever they were thirsty. I had allowed them to define my worth. And their valuation had just been made painfully, laughably clear. I was worth 79 cents. In that moment, the grief I had been carrying for my lost husband transformed into a different kind of strength. It was his voice, his belief in me, that echoed in the quiet of my kitchen and gave me permission to do what I knew I had to do. The enabling was over. The Bank of Mom was officially, permanently closed. I would no longer be the silent, smiling investor in my own diminishment. I would no longer fund my own erasure. I walked over to the magnet, pulled it off the fridge, and without a second thought, I dropped it into the kitchen trash can. It made a small, unsatisfying clatter as it hit the bottom. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of administration. A closing of a ledger that had been unbalanced for far too long. I was done being the world's best mom according to their definition. It was time to become the protector of my own life. My own worth. And my own future. The decision didn't feel vengeful or bitter. It felt sane. It felt like breathing after being held underwater for a very, very long time. What my son and his wife never knew, what they never once thought to ask about, was the truth of my financial life. They saw the small house, the old car, the frugal habits, and they constructed a narrative that suited them. The narrative of poor old Mom, a woman of modest means, a little fragile, a little lonely, a woman whose greatest asset was the equity in her home, which they were already mentally spending. They saw a widow who needed their guidance, their oh-so-modern sensibilities to navigate the world. They saw a resource to be managed, and eventually, a burden to be housed. What they failed to see was me. The real me. And they had absolutely no idea about Frank. My husband, Frank, was a genius. He didn't have a college degree, and he had grease under his fingernails most of his life from his job as an auto mechanic, but his mind was sharper than any CEO's I've ever met. He didn't trust institutions. He didn't trust smooth-talking men in suits. He didn't trust get-rich-quick schemes. He trusted mathematics. He trusted history. And he trusted me. Starting from the first year of our marriage, he made a rule. 10% of every single paycheck, no matter how small, went into an investment account. He spent his evenings not in front of the television, but at the kitchen table with the Wall Street Journal, with Moody's manuals, with books on value investing by people like Benjamin Graham. He wasn't a gambler, he was a farmer. He bought small pieces of solid, boring, reliable companies, utilities, consumer staples, railways, and he let them grow. He taught me everything. I wasn't just his wife, I was his partner, his apprentice. We would sit at that table for hours, poring over quarterly reports and balance sheets. He'd point to a column of figures and say, "See this, Helen. Debt-to-equity ratio. That tells you if a company is standing on rock or on sand, or, look at the dividend history. A company that pays its shareholders consistently, through good times and bad, that's a company with discipline." I had a head for numbers from my bookkeeping work, and I soaked it all up. We lived modestly not because we had to, but because we wanted to. We found joy in simple things, fishing on the lake, tending our garden, a night out at the local diner. We had no interest in fancy cars or designer clothes. To us, wealth wasn't something you wore on your wrist. It was something you built, quietly and patiently. It was freedom. It was security. It was peace of mind. When Frank passed away, the portfolio became my sole responsibility. In his will, he didn't just leave it to me, he left a note for me with his lawyer. It said, "To Helen. You know what to do. You're the best partner a man could have ever asked for. Now, go live a wonderful life. You've earned it," and I had managed it. For 10 years, I had continued our strategy. I made the trades. I reinvested the dividends. I watched it grow. Mark and Samantha had no clue. They never asked, "Mom, how are you managing?" or "Do you need any help with your finances?" Their questions were always pointed in one direction: "Can you help us?" Their perception of me was so fixed, so condescendingly simple, that the possibility of me having my own substantial, independent financial life was beyond their imagination. To them, my $75,000 loan for their failed business was a monumental, back-breaking sacrifice that must have wiped me out. In reality, while it was a significant amount of money that I had to work to repay to my own house's equity, it was a fraction of the portfolio Frank and I had built. I let them believe their narrative because, in a way, it was easier. Confronting them with the truth would have required a level of emotional honesty our relationship no longer had. But the magnet changed everything. The magnet wasn't just an insult, it was a diagnosis. It revealed the terminal nature of their self-absorption. They saw me as a piggy bank to be shaken, but they never once considered the possibility that the piggy bank was, in fact, a fortified vault. The irony was staggering. They, with their leased cars and their mountain of consumer debt, felt superior to me, the woman who could have written a check to clear their entire net worth, and not even notice the dip. They patted me on the head, and offered me trinkets, while I quietly held the deed to their entire lifestyle. And as I stood in my kitchen that Sunday evening, the full weight of this irony settled upon me. My quiet life, my modest choices, had been the perfect camouflage. My frugality, which they saw as a weakness, was actually the guardian of my power. And I decided, with a calmness that felt almost supernatural, that it was time to take off the camouflage. It was time to introduce my son to the woman his father had always known I was. Not poor old mom, not the world's best mom, just Helen. A woman of means. A woman of strength. And, as of that day, a woman who was no longer for sale. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. For the first time in a decade, I felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs. It was a clean, sharp feeling, like the crisp morning air. I made a pot of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, my command center, and I made my first call. I dialed the number of Mr. Davies, our lawyer, from memory. He had been Frank's friend since they were boys and had handled our affairs for over 30 years. He was a kind, decent man who embodied old-fashioned integrity. Davies, Thompson, and Howe, his secretary's voice chirped. "Mr. Davis' office, please." "It's Helen Kowalski calling," I said, my own voice steady and clear. A moment later, his warm, familiar baritone was on the line. "Helen. How lovely to hear from you. Is everything all right?" "Everything is about to be, Arthur," I said. "I need to schedule a meeting. As soon as possible." "I'm restructuring." There was a brief pause. "Restructuring?" he asked, a note of gentle concern in his voice. "Yes," I said. "I'm liquidating some assets, rewriting my will, and cutting off a few liabilities. I'd like you to handle the paperwork." I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. Mr. Davies knew the general state of my finances, and he certainly knew the state of my son. He was the one who had reluctantly drafted the paperwork for the second mortgage years ago, advising me against it in the strongest possible terms. "Helen, I am at your disposal," he said, the concern in his voice now replaced with something else, respect. "Can you be here tomorrow at 10? The appointment was set. My next task was gathering the evidence. I went to the old metal filing cabinet in my spare room, the one that held the records of my life. I pulled out the file labeled marked. It was thick. I spread the contents across the dining room table. There it was, a copy of the loan agreement for his failed business, signed by me. Never repaid. There were the co-signed documents for the mortgage on his and Samantha's grotesquely oversized house. A house in a gated community, with a name like Whispering Pines that didn't have a single pine tree in it. As the co-signer, I was just as responsible for that mortgage as they were. It was a financial handcuff I had willingly put on. And there were my own bank statements from the last 5 years, with withdrawals highlighted in yellow. Every month, like clockwork, a transfer of $1,500 to their account. I had a note in the memo line of each one. Car payment, help, groceries, Jack's soccer camp. It was a paper trail of my own foolishness, an audit of my enabling. But now, it was not a record of shame. It was a record of fact. It was ammunition. The rest of the week was a blur of quiet, decisive action. I met with Mr. Davies, who looked over the documents with a grim, knowing expression. He was my ally, the voice of reason. "Frank always said you were the tough one, Helen," he said with a small smile. "He knew you'd know when to draw the line. I'm proud of you." His validation was like a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still open. He immediately set to work. We drafted a letter to the bank, formally withdrawing my position as co-signer on the mortgage, an action that would trigger a review and force Mark and Samantha to requalify on their own income, an impossibility. We drafted a new will, one that left the bulk of my estate to a charitable trust Frank and I had always planned to start, dedicated to funding trade school scholarships for kids who, like him, wanted to work with their hands. A small, carefully managed trust was set aside for my grandchildren's education, but with strict stipulations that Mark and Samantha could not touch a penny of it. The rest. It was mine. For my life. My travels. My future. The next day, I went to my bank, the one I'd used for 50 years, and I closed all my accounts. I walked across the street to a new institution, where no one knew my name, and opened a new set of accounts under a new structure, advised by Mr. Davies. The final, most satisfying step was a simple one. I went into my online banking portal, found the recurring monthly transfer of $1,500 to Mark's account, and I hit delete. The system asked, "Are you sure you want to cancel this scheduled payment?" I pressed confirm with a sense of profound finality. It wasn't a grand, dramatic gesture. There was no audience. It was just me, in my quiet house, systematically dismantling the architecture of my own servitude. Each signature was a declaration of independence. Each phone call was a brick being laid in the foundation of my new life. I wasn't burning bridges. I was rerouting a river that had been flowing in the wrong direction for far too long. The water was now being channeled back to its source. Me? The silence lasted for exactly 8 days. I had been counting. On the 9th day, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Mark. I let it ring 3 times before answering, taking a deep, calming breath. "Hello, Mark," I said, my voice even and placid. "Mom?" "Hey. How are you?" he asked, his voice oozing a forced, casual bonhomie that immediately set my teeth on edge. This was his "I'm about to ask for something" voice. "I'm very well, thank you," I replied. Good, good. "Hey, listen, weird thing," he started, the practiced lightness in his tone almost comical. "Samantha's car payment got declined. I guess the automatic transfer didn't go through this month. Did you forget to set it up or something?" I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. "No, Mark," I said, my voice still perfectly level. "I didn't forget." There was another pause, this one filled with his confusion. "Oh? So, what happened?" "I cancelled it," I said. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered without anger or emotion. It was like reporting the weather. The silence on the other end of the line was profound. I could hear him breathing. I could practically hear the cogs in his brain grinding, trying to process a piece of information that did not compute with his reality. "You cancelled it," he repeated, as if the words were in a foreign language. "Why would you do that?" "I've decided to make some changes to my financial arrangements," I said calmly. "That monthly transfer is one of those changes." "What changes?" "Mom, are you okay? Are you feeling all right?" The condescension was immediate, the default setting. My actions couldn't possibly be rational, therefore, I must be unwell. Senile, perhaps. Confused. This was the narrative they were comfortable with. "I've never felt better, Mark," I said, and the truth of that statement resonated in my own ears. "But, the car payment," he stammered, his voice starting to lose its smooth veneer. "We were counting on that, I know," I said. And I left it there. I didn't offer a solution. I didn't apologize. I just stated a fact. He mumbled something about needing to talk to Samantha and hung up. The first crack in their perfect facade had appeared. The second call came 3 days later. This time, it was from a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously. "Hello. Mrs. Kowalski," a professional-sounding woman asked. "This is Sandra Evans from Sterling National Bank. I'm calling regarding the mortgage for the property at 14 Orchardgate Lane." My heart gave a little flutter, but my voice remained steady. "Yes? We received a formal notice from your legal counsel, Mr. Davies, indicating your withdrawal as a guarantor and co-signer on the loan. I need to inform you that this action has triggered a covenant review. The primary borrowers, Mark and Samantha Kowalski, will need to be reassessed for eligibility, and will likely need to refinance the loan under their own standing. I understand, I said. Thank you for letting me know. I hung up. Not 2 minutes later, my phone exploded. It was Mark again, and this time there was no pretense of casualness. His voice was high-pitched with panic. Mom? What did you do? The bank just called me. They said you pulled out of the mortgage. What is going on? I heard Samantha's voice, shrill and furious, in the background. Let me talk to her, she shrieked. The phone was fumbled, and suddenly her voice was in my ear. Helen. What in God's name do you think you're doing? Are you trying to make us homeless? We could lose the house. The children. Have you thought about your grandchildren at all in this? The appeal to the grandchildren. The ultimate emotional blackmail. It was predictable, and for the first time, it had absolutely no effect on me. It was like listening to a badly written play. Samantha, I said, my tone still infuriatingly calm. My financial decisions are my own. You and Mark have a mortgage that you signed for. It is your responsibility, our responsibility. You co-signed. You promised to help us, she screamed. I did help you, I corrected her gently. I helped you secure a loan for a house you could not afford. I have been helping you pay for a lifestyle you cannot afford. I have decided to stop. There was a sound like a strangled sob. You can't do this. You're our mother. You're supposed to love us. Love, I said, the word tasting strange in my mouth, is not a financial transaction, Samantha. I am learning that a little late in life, but I am learning it. I could hear Mark in the background now, his voice a low, panicked murmur to his wife. They were imploding. Their carefully curated world, built on a foundation of my money and their entitlement, was crumbling, and they had no idea why. They couldn't comprehend a world in which I was not their ever-present, ever-giving safety net. Their panic was a symphony to me. Not because I was cruel, but because it was the sound of reality finally dawning. It was the sound of consequences arriving, long overdue. I ended the call. I have a meeting to get to. We can discuss this later. If you can manage to speak to me with respect. I hung up the phone, and the silence that followed in my little house was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. They showed up 2 days later. I knew they would. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in my garden, pruning my rose bushes. Frank had planted them for me on our 10th anniversary. Tending to them always made me feel close to him. I saw their oversized SUV pull up to the curb with an aggressive squeal of its tires. They didn't park neatly, they half-mounted the curb, as if they were in too much of a hurry for basic civic courtesies. Mark and Samantha emerged, their faces thunderous. They stormed up my walkway, and I watched them come, not moving from my spot beside the prize-winning Queen Elizabeth roses. I felt no fear, no anxiety. Just a profound, settled calm. I had been preparing for this confrontation my entire life. I just hadn't known it. Mom, we need to talk, Mark said, his voice tight with a barely controlled rage. He didn't even say hello. Hello, Mark? Samantha, I said, snipping a dead bloom from a bush. You're trampling my petunias. They glanced down, oblivious. We are not worried about your damn petunias, Helen. Samantha snapped. You are trying to ruin our lives. I sighed, placed my pruning shears in my basket, and took off my gardening gloves. All right, I said. Let's go inside. If you're going to yell at me, you can at least do it in the privacy of my home. I led them into the living room. The house felt small and modest compared to their cavernous, decorated design space, and I could see the disdain in Samantha's eyes as she scanned the familiar furniture. I had already put a pot of tea on to steep. I poured 3 cups. I knew they wouldn't drink it, but the ritual of it scented me. It was an act of civility in the face of their barbarism. They stood in the middle of the room, refusing to sit, like prosecutors before a judge. They began their tirade. It was a torrent of accusation, a fire hose of blame. I was selfish. I was cruel. I was losing my mind. How could I do this to them? After everything they did for me. What had they done for me, exactly? Visited on holidays. Sent a text on my birthday. We include you in our lives. Mark shouted, his face red. We took you to that beautiful brunch for Mother's Day. The brunch? The catalyst. It was almost beautiful in its poetic justice. I let them exhaust themselves. I just sat in Frank's old armchair, sipping my tea, and I listened. I let all the poison they had stored up pour out into the quiet air of my home. When they finally sputtered to a stop, breathless and furious, the silence returned. I set my teacup down on its saucer with a gentle click. Are you finished? I asked quietly. They stared at me, nonplussed. Now it's my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was my amplifier. You talk about love and family, Mark. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the 18 months I worked 2 jobs, 7 days a week, so you could have a normal senior year while your father was dying. Let's talk about my mother's pearls, which I sold so you could go to your first choice college with your girlfriend. Let's talk about the $75,000 I took from the value of this house, my only security, to fund a business idea that was doomed from the start. A loan you never repaid a single penny of. I looked at Samantha. Let's talk about the $1,500 a month, every month, for the last 5 years, that has been paying for your car, your organic dog food, your children's expensive camps, because your lifestyle has always been more important than your budget. I let the words hang in the air. Their faces had gone from red with anger to pale with shock. They had never heard it all laid out like this, a detailed accounting of my devotion. They had only ever experienced it piece by piece, as a series of convenient solutions to their immediate problems. You stand there in my house, I continued, my voice still low and even, and you accuse me of trying to ruin you. You accuse me of being selfish. For 40 years, my entire life has revolved around your needs, your wants, your dreams. I have been your emergency fund, your safety net, your silent partner in a life you didn't earn. Then, I stood up and walked to the small mahogany desk in the corner. I picked up the one thing I had saved from that day. I hadn't thrown it away after all. I had kept it for this very moment. I walked back and held it out on the palm of my hand. The cheap, plastic magnet with the googly eyes. On Mother's Day, you gave your mother-in-law a diamond bracelet worth more than my car. A symbol of her value to you. And you gave me this. A 79-cent piece of plastic you picked up at a checkout counter. This is what my lifetime of sacrifice is worth in your estimation. This is the price you put on my love. Mark stared at the magnet, as if it were a scorpion. He couldn't speak. So, I have decided to accept your valuation, I said, my voice turning cold and clinical. My support is now worth exactly what you paid for it. Nothing. I saw the last bit of fight drain out of them, replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't a momentary lapse. This was a verdict. And then I delivered the final blow. You have always been so concerned about my finances, always hinting that I should sell this big old house and move into a more manageable apartment. So let me put your minds at ease. You don't have to worry about my finances. Frank was a very wise man. I am not the poor, struggling widow you imagined me to be. In fact, I could afford to buy your house and turn it into a parking lot without blinking an eye. I looked directly at Mark. Let me ask you a question. If you had known that, would you still have given me the magnet? The look on his face, the sickening, twisting combination of greed, regret, and utter shock, was the only answer I would ever need. The confrontation left a vacuum in its wake. There was no more shouting, no more pleading. Just a dense, suffocating silence filled with the wreckage of their assumptions. Mark and Samantha stood in my living room like statues, their faces blank with disbelief. The world as they knew it had been upended, and they didn't have the emotional tools to navigate the new landscape. I laid out the terms, not as a negotiation, but as a statement of fact. "Mr. Davies will be in touch with you regarding the house," I said, my voice devoid of all warmth. It was the voice of a bank manager discussing a defaulted loan. "You will have 90 days to refinance the mortgage in your own names. If you are unable to, the property will have to be sold. Either way, my name is to be removed from the deed and the loan." I paused. "The monthly financial support has ended, permanently. My will has been changed. My estate is no longer your concern. What happens to me and my assets from this day forward is my business, and mine alone." Samantha made one last, desperate attempt, her voice a pathetic whisper. "But, you are our family." "You had a family," I corrected her gently. "You had a mother, who would have done anything for you. And you traded her for a lifestyle you couldn't afford and a diamond bracelet. I hope it was worth it." I walked to the front door and opened it. It was a clear dismissal. They stumbled out, looking dazed, like survivors of a wreck. I watched them get into their expensive, leased SUV, a car they would now have to figure out how to pay for, and drive away. I closed the door, leaned against it, and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 20 years. There was no joy in their destruction, no thrill of victory. There was only a profound, quiet, and deeply satisfying sense of peace. The aftermath was handled with the cool efficiency of my lawyer. Mr. Davies was a shield, absorbing their panicked calls, their desperate emails, their attempts to bargain. They tried everything. They sent my grandchildren to call me, their little voices coached to say, "Grandma, we miss you, Mommy is crying." It was a cruel tactic, and it was the only thing that caused me a pang of real pain, not for me, but for how they were using their own children as pawns. But I held firm. As predicted, they were unable to refinance the house. Their income-to-debt ratio was a disaster without my name on the books. They were forced to sell. They had to downsize dramatically, moving into a small rental townhome on the far side of the city, a place with no gates and no prestige. The imported SUV was returned to the dealership. Samantha's social media posts, once a constant stream of lavish vacations and expensive dinners, went silent. My own life, in contrast, began to blossom. Selling my own house, the home I had shared with Frank, was the final step. I thought it would be heartbreaking, but it was surprisingly liberating. I hired an estate sale company to clear it out, keeping only a few precious things: Frank's armchair, our wedding album, his toolbox, and my rose bushes, which I had professionally dug up and potted. The house was no longer a sanctuary of memories, it had become the scene of a crime, the place where my generosity had been exploited. Letting it go was like washing my hands of the entire affair. With the proceeds from the sale and a small portion of the portfolio Frank and I had built, I bought a small condominium 2 states away, in a quiet coastal town where no one knew my name. It had a wide balcony that overlooked the ocean, and every morning, I would sit out there with my coffee and watch the sun rise over the water. The sound of the waves replaced the memory of my son's panicked phone calls. I had my rose bushes planted in large terracotta pots on that balcony, and they thrived in the salt air. I joined a local watercolor class, something I had always wanted to do. My first paintings were clumsy and amateurish, but they were mine. They were pictures of seashells and sailboats and endless blue horizons. I started traveling. Not to the flashy resorts Samantha would have chosen, but to quiet, interesting places. I took a train through the Canadian Rockies. I visited the small villages of Ireland. I spent a month in New Mexico, mesmerized by the desert light. I was living the life Frank and I had always planned for our old age, the life he had written about in his note, "Go live a wonderful life. You've earned it." I was finally honoring his last wish. And I was doing it for myself. I was no longer a mother, a widow, a resource. I was just Helen. A woman painting a picture. A woman reading a book on her balcony. A woman walking on the beach, alone and perfectly, wonderfully content. I'm sitting on that balcony now. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that I might try to capture on paper tomorrow. The air is cool and smells of salt and roses. It's been 2 years since that Mother's Day. I hear from my grandchildren occasionally. I send them birthday cards and Christmas gifts, routed through Mr. Davis' office to keep my address private. I want them to know they are loved, but I cannot allow their parents to use them as a bridge back into my life. Some bridges, once burned, should stay down for the safety of those on the other side. As for Mark and Samantha, I have not spoken to them directly since that day in my living room. I know, through my lawyer, that Mark has a steady, unglamorous job in middle management. They are living within their means, for the first time in their lives. Perhaps it is the best thing that could have happened to them. Perhaps not. It is no longer my concern. My story isn't about revenge. Revenge is a hot, bitter meal. What I have found is something far better, it's peace. It's the reclamation of my own soul. I learned that a mother's love shouldn't be a blank check for disrespect. It's not an endless resource to be plundered. It's a treasure. And if it's treated like a cheap trinket, you have every right to put it back in the vault and lock the door. You are the guardian of your own worth. No one can bestow it upon you, and no one should be allowed to diminish it. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, it's an act of self-preservation. It's telling the world, and yourself, that you matter. The magnet taught me a hard lesson. It taught me that my value wasn't determined by how much I gave, but by how much I was willing to protect. My real worth wasn't in the sacrifices I made for my son, it was in the strength I finally found to make a choice for myself. So I want to ask you, the person listening to my story, what would you have done in my place? At what point does unconditional love become an unacceptable condition for your own life? What is the true price of self-respect? I would genuinely love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and your perspectives are a powerful reminder that none of us are truly alone in these struggles. And if my story resonated with you, if it gave you a little bit of strength, or a moment of clarity, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. There are so many stories to tell, and so much life yet to live. Thank you for listening.